Welcome to CEO Money. I'm Michael Yorba. Thanks for joining with us. I have Kevin Werbach, author, The Blockchain and the Architecture of Trust. All right, Kevin, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
All right, tell me about blockchain, how it went from the creation of an anonymous cyberpunk and then was mainly used for illegal activity to a technology championed by Walmart, New York Stock Exchange, and other governments.
Blockchain is a family of technologies for decentralized trust. It's a way to exchange value, and that could be money, or it could be anything else of value, but to exchange it in a way where there's no central authority in the middle. You don't have to worry about an intermediary like a bank. You don't have to worry even about a government agency that's overseeing the process to securely exchange value.
Right.
This was first introduced in the technology for Bitcoin, which was the first successful cryptocurrency 10 years ago. Halloween of 2018, someone going by the name of Satoshi Nakamoto put out a 9-page white paper describing the structure of this cryptocurrency. And people picked it up and actually on January 3rd, which happens to be my birthday in 2009, launched this network. And ever since, Bitcoin has existed as money, as something that people can trust as being valuable for exchange. And even though Bitcoin, it's dropped a lot in recent months, but for most of the time, Bitcoin has been worth something like $100 billion. No one's been able to hack the network. No one has been able to undermine the basic security of this technology, even though it's not based on any traditional kind of control. It's purely decentralized. So that appeals to lots of different people. Initially, the community that was very involved in the development of Bitcoin were people who said, great, we don't need governments to issue money. We don't have to worry about following laws. We don't have to worry about national borders. But it turns out that, first of all, that's a relatively small percentage of people. It turns out that you can actually track the transactions on Bitcoin because it's a public network. And it turns out that there's actually a much bigger opportunity to use this mechanism of decentralized value exchange in all sorts of things that are entirely legitimate, some of them financial and some of them non-financial, which really potentially have huge implications.
They do. We deal with that a lot through the conversations I have here. Let me drill down a little bit on about how blockchain responds to the pervasive collapse of trust in our society. There's a lack of trust about this from government oversight agencies, SEC, things of that nature. Some of the new ways that people are using blockchain in regards to cryptocurrencies. So let's open the door on that one there.
Yeah, we all know that we're living in a time where trust is collapsing.
Yep.
And timing is really essential in the development and take-up of any new technology. There are lots of technologies that were brilliant, but were way too early, for example. Even though Bitcoin was not actually designed in response to the 2008 financial crisis, it came out right in the midst of that catastrophe at a time when people were skeptical about the traditional financial players and skeptical about government entities. And that got a lot of people and organizations to be willing to take a look at something. It sounds crazy that you can actually create money out of nothing with decentralized software, but the time was right for it. And I talk in the book about blockchain, which is the underlying technology that Bitcoin and other systems like it use. I talk about it as a new architecture of trust. So it's not the end of trust. You've still got to trust Bitcoin. You still got to trust that what you get is valuable. You still got to trust that this is a system that works, but you don't have to trust any particular actor in the middle of it. And it turns out that that is really powerful. It's also powerful for large companies where many kinds of interactions, whether it's syndicated loans in the financial system or supply chains in the global logistics system, all require different companies to come together, interact, share information, share data, share things of value without fully trusting one another. And so more and more, there's a need for mechanisms that overcome all of the intermediaries and additional steps and additional costs we put in the middle of these processes to deal with that lack of trust. And blockchain is getting so much attention and so much adoption because it's arrived at a time where there's a need for something like that that can just cut through all those limitations.
We have other things to talk about, but you bring up a question that's been looming in my head. We really haven't tested the cryptocurrencies through the use of blockchain, of course, but in a financial crisis. We've had several of them that I've lived through. The earliest one, I'm not that old, but the earliest one was the S&L crisis. Had we had blockchain connected to cryptocurrencies during these processes, or the 2008 financial crisis that we had, what do you think that the resiliency of creating a storehouse of value or a currency exchange or an exchange of value during a financial, full-blown financial crisis, how do you think this is would roll out if we had that kind of stress on the economic system, and now we have cryptocurrencies to work with, not just the old fiat currencies which were blown up during that process?
Yeah, again, it's a good question. It's a question of timing. So there are many advocates for cryptocurrencies who say this will be the safe haven, that when the next collapse comes, people will look for cryptocurrencies as a store of value because they're not dependent on governments. They're not dependent on monetary policy of any government. It's just based on an algorithm.
Right.
But the reality is, you look at the cryptocurrency market today, first of all, it's all still denominated in dollars. We talk about the price of Bitcoin. A Bitcoin is worth $4,000 because we still think of the fiat currency, the dollar, as the underlying source of value. You look at how big cryptocurrencies are. They're huge by some measures, but even at the absolute peak, $800 billion of market capitalization in cryptocurrencies, by the standards of the global financial system, that's tiny. The Depository Trust Corporation, which trades stocks in the United States, is the intermediary for all stock transactions in the United States, did about $1.4 quadrillion of transactions last year. So we're definitely going in a direction where the cryptocurrencies are maturing more, where there's a greater confidence, and where some institutions, some family offices, some sovereign governments are starting to see the potential of this as a hedge. As something like gold that's not correlated with the traditional financial system, where it might be valuable as part of a portfolio to use it that way. I'm skeptical anytime soon we'll see what's often called hyper-Bitcoinization, where everything will switch over to this mechanism. Because the reality is, it gets back to this idea of trust, which I talk a lot about in the book. It's not that trust magically happens just because you have security at the ledger. What Bitcoin and the blockchain technology do is ensure the baseline security of moving value across the network. But there's still all sorts of other things you have to trust. You have to trust, for example, in Bitcoin, the miners who are providing that. You have to trust the code. You have to have trust in the dispute resolution systems. What happens if someone steals your cryptographic private keys? It's a bearer instrument. Your money's gone. How do you get it back? What happens if you have a disagreement with someone? There's no court to resolve this in cyberspace. So there are all these sorts of issues, and there's lots of great work going on to overcome them. But if the next financial crash happened today, there would certainly be more take-up in cryptocurrencies than we saw in 2008 when it was just very new. But I still don't think we're at the point where they would somehow replace the existing system.
The trend that I'm seeing when it comes to STOs versus ICOs, and I'm seeing, because I talk to people about this all the time, and I'm seeing that the trend that the Securities Exchange Commission is trying to drive forward is to get the cryptocurrencies to be based on something, not just an arbitrary agreed amount value, of what people are exchanging the value for. It's got to be backed by something. It's got to be backed by the value of the company through the balance sheet, the revenue stream, the assets underlying it. If you're going to have a sustainable model for using it as a viable currency or a variety of viable currencies. And I'm wondering your take on that, because they're really putting a lot of pressure on the cryptocurrency value and price now. How do you see that unfolding?
That's not exactly what's happening. So the issue is, if you are a company or some sort of entity and you want to raise capital by issuing tokens, the question is, does that have to follow the securities laws? And the securities laws exist to protect investors. So if I go to you and say, I've got this great hot opportunity, you're going to make a lot of money, buy my token, should I be required, for example, to not lie to you? Should I be totally free to make any fraudulent representation, whatever, promise you the moon and not? Should I be free to sell it to you and then disappear? Should I be free to not have to disclose to you, to just say, oh, this is great, but I'm not going to give you all the details of my financials? Most people in that kind of investment situation would say, well, no, you should at least have to be truthful. And if you lie to me, I should have some rights. You should have to disclose the information so I can make an adequate decision. What the SEC is saying, that's the difference between what's often called a utility token offering, an ICO, and a security token offering. What the SEC is saying is, if what you're fundamentally doing is going to investors and raising capital for a business type venture, that's what's called an investment contract. It's essentially a security. You have to provide those kinds of protections to investors. Now, those protections are fairly onerous. If you don't want to have to do the full-blown IPO, which is very onerous, you have to pretty much limit yourself to accredited investors, which are relatively wealthy investors. So there are those constraints in the U.S. system, but it's not about what it's backed by. The whole issue is the requirement of those protections. The issue is, well, there's a couple issues. One issue is it's a global phenomenon, and some other countries have provided more scope for utility token offerings with lesser requirements. We'll see how that plays out. The reality is there have been some very useful, valuable ICO offerings. There have been a lot of scams out there, a lot of times where people really are subject to fraud. So there needs to be some oversight. And what we're starting to see is different countries coming up with different mechanisms of oversight. The SEC looking at more light ways to allow people to raise capital. The SEC actually, in their most recent statement where they did some sanctions against companies, said, look, there's a path to compliance. Even if you have offered an ICO and not classified as a security, if you haven't committed fraud, then come talk to us. Maybe if you go back to your investors and say, well, here's all the disclosure we didn't give you before. If you want your money back, you get your money back. But if you don't want your money back, then we'll just go forward. That may allow them to come into compliance. So it's actually a fast-moving situation where if you look at the numbers, the U.S. is still one of the largest markets in the world for these kinds of offerings, because that's where the capital is, and that's where a lot of the developers are. So it's a bit of a misnomer that the regulators have come down with a hammer and stopped all this activity. What they stopped was the kind of Wild West, which frankly, for the most part, was really not in this interest of investors, and was causing the sense that this was just all a big scam.
Got it. Okay, so that's where you're seeing convergence with law, regulation, and a sustainable form of value transactions or value transfer can take place?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a back and forth process. And so there's no question regulators can come down too hard. There's no question laws can be bad. But I spent time in the U.S. government working on internet policy 20 years ago, and it was a conversation. And the issue is governments are not trying to stop this stuff just because they want to stop it or just because they're somehow getting bribed by the incumbents. They're looking and saying, all right, my job is to protect investors. My job is to promote capital formation and innovation. Tell me how this is going to help me do that. And if you can tell me that, let's work together. I understand your needs. Here are my legal constraints. And this is the ongoing process that has been happening. And it's happening globally now. So if, in fact, Singapore or the UK or some of these other jurisdictions can come up with a better system that makes more sense for some of these offerings, where they are willing to move to those jurisdictions or only solicit capital in those jurisdictions, then they're going to succeed at that. The United States is looking at a much broader market. They don't care if a few people go and do things in Malta or Gibraltar. They're looking at, can we provide a foundation on top of all of the capital and the activity that's here? So yes, it's a slow, muddy process. It's not perfect. But we are starting to see that, where you're starting to see more and more a recognition of quality. It's not just anyone can throw up a white paper there and raise $100 million in some ICO just because retail investors in Korea have this FOMO that they want to get in and not miss out. We're starting to get to a point where at least it's a more rational market. And in the long run, that's really healthy for everyone.
I got it. We've had people, I've seen them even on broadcast, saying that, okay, maybe Bitcoin's at 3,500, or I think he came out when it was at 3,500 over the weekend, and saying, but they see the value of Bitcoin rolling all the way up to past 20,000 again. Do you see that kind of favor getting back into cryptocurrencies as we go forward?
No idea. So I don't know what the investment price of Bitcoin or any other cryptocurrency will be. I think that's a legitimate thing to be an investor trading in a crypto asset if you've got a strong investment thesis about where it's going to go. To me, that's the least interesting part of this. The first interesting question is, why is it not zero? Again, because it's this totally decentralized system. It's not zero. Major institutions and traditional players and governments are getting involved and saying, no, we agree legitimately this is a source of value. Mm-hmm. The other problem is there is still all of this fraud and manipulation that is monkeying with the price around the world. So until we get to a point where exchanges around the world aren't front-running their own customers' trades, where there aren't these somewhat questionable stable coins that claim to be backed by dollars that aren't, where there's not the false wash trading going on, all sorts of things that are illegal under regular securities laws. Until we're past that point, I don't think you can realistically have any confidence on what the price is of these crypto assets. That being said, it's supply and demand. So sure, if there is more uptake of utilization, and utilization can be many different things for these different tokens. It might be distributed applications. It might be people using these for retail transactions. It might be for store of value. The institutional money comes in, sees this as a new asset class. One can construct all sorts of scenarios. But for me, I'm less interested in whether there's something that's going to go to the moon as an investment than whether there's the possibility to build a brand new financial system and to build a brand new structure for a decentralized internet that can allow the creation of all kinds of new applications in a way that's not hierarchically controlled. We've seen so much damage caused by the fact that big platforms like Facebook and Google have sucked up all the data and pulled it all into their advertising model. And that's what they should be doing. That's a legitimate thing to do with their business model. The only way that we might get out of that dynamic and get to a business model that's more fair and more open and better for individuals is on a decentralized foundation like this. So to me, that's the big story. Nothing wrong with people trading and wanting to see the price go up. But I think if you just focus on that, then you're basically just sort of looking at things through the old lens of financial trading.
Well put. Kevin, thanks for being a guest on this show.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. You've been watching CEO Money with Michael Yorba. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.